book of Genesis, have been for a few weeks. This is lesson number 14. And tonight we're going to do something I don't normally do, but we're going to skip most of Genesis chapter 10. There's a section in there that I want to read because it ties into chapter 11. So we're going to read just 6 verses in chapter 10, and then we'll go into chapter 11. So it's verses 7 through 12. So far, we've talked about the creation, we've talked about the fall of mankind, we've talked about how man became more and more sinful. Then we had the flood. Then Noah and his sons come off the ark. And now chapter 10 is primarily a list of nations, really, that came out of Noah's descendants, his sons. There's one in particular we're going to read about because it's going to feed into the Tower of Babel. How many have heard of the Tower of Babel, right? So chapter 11, that's what we're mostly going to talk about tonight. But let's read verses 7 through 12. We'll talk about the importance of that. This is the sons of Cush. Cush was the son of Ham, the one that Noah cursed because of him basically just not rebelling against him, but making fun of him, light of him, not respecting him and honoring him. When he found him naked, instead he told his brothers, and if you remember all that story that we talked about just a couple of weeks ago. So we're going to read verses 7 through 12. The sons of Cush were Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Ramah, and Sabteca, and the sons of Ramah were Sheba and Dedan. Cush begat Nimrod. Nimrod, we're going to talk about him. It's interesting. He began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. That is the principal city. So it tells us here that Cush, which is a descendant of Noah, but also of a descendant of the lineage of Ham, and that he begat Nimrod. Now, I found this very interesting. Had never seen this before when I was studying it. But when we look at Nimrod, he is talked about as a mighty one on the earth. But what you don't know until you do a little bit of research is that he was not a good man. You can look at it and say he's a mighty hunter, but what that's really talking about is that he was a mighty warrior and that he killed a lot of people and is responsible for a whole lot of rebellion against God. So you don't pick up on that until you begin to just get just a little bit deeper than the surface of that. He ruled over Babel. You've heard of Babel, right? Which is also Babylon, right? I mean, knows that has always been a city that God talks about the rebellion of Babylon, right? Throughout history, not just from the beginning here in Genesis, but even all the way into Revelation. Have you seen Babylon referenced even in Revelation? So it's very interesting when we see that. And the name Nimrod means let us rebel. Wow. Names meant something in the Bible, in particular in the Old Testament for sure. So Nimrod was not a good man, although you could look at it and say, oh, he's a mighty hunter, but it was a hunter of men. And he was also led the rebellion that you'll see, because he's the captain of that city, that you'll see that those who were rebellious against the Lord and begin to build that tower and all of that. So very interesting as we look at that. So we're going to skip forward to chapter 11. We're going to read the first 4 verses. And it's going to say in the plain of Shinar, but that's the same thing as Babel or Babylon. All right? Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. So up until this point, whatever language Adam and Eve spoke, that is what had continued on up until this point. And God's going to change all that. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Then they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city, and a tower whose top is in the heavens." That's very interesting. "Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." Now, long story short, little glimpse, they didn't want to get scattered, but God does it anyway, right? Because when you rebel against God, most of the time, what you don't want is what you're going to get, right? So very interesting as we see this. So the whole earth had one language, because they had all come from one man, Adam, and that makes sense as we look at that. So there was one language, and the people were just kind of localized, right? When they got off of the ark, instead of spreading out like they were actually commanded to do, they mostly stayed in that Babel or Babylon or Shinar area. And God had told them in Genesis 10:10 that they were to spread out over the whole earth. He said, populate it, right? Remember when we rehearsed what God told them to do? Be fruitful, multiply, but he added a little bit to it and said, cover the whole earth. So they were in rebellion against God whenever they stayed. And certainly, and we'll talk about that in a minute, when they built the tower, they were certainly in rebellion. So these multiplied descendants that came from the ark, they built this great city and a great tower in rebellion against God's command to spread out over the earth. I'm sorry, it's Genesis 9:1 where God commanded them to spread out over the earth. I mistook that. So, come, let us build ourselves a city. It's a disobedient to God's command to fill the earth. And think about this. So, there has been a flood that covered not only the whole earth and the trees and the vegetation, but even above the tops of the highest mountains. And I told you that when I was looking at that, there is now some study that says that even at Mount Everest, at the top, there's indication that there was a flood there. So the Bible's true, right? And we know that. So not only did they directly disobey God's command to not spread out across the earth, but now, because they're building a tower, why would you build a tower if you know you've had a flood? Right? And you know that God has said that I'm not going to flood it again, but yet they build a tower anyway. Because of unbelief, they build the tower. And they began to, and the Tower of Babel has more to it than just that they're building a tower. They're trying to get, in case God ever does flood again, they're trying to get higher and higher up into the, they said the sky, basically. Obviously, they can't build it into the heaven, but they're going to build it really high so that if God ever does flood it again, maybe they can escape it. But what you don't know is that much of the witchcraft and the sorcery and the astrology, the bad kind, that has to do with demonic activity comes from the Tower of Babel. It was like an observatory for them. and they were in direct disobedience, but also unbelief, because God had said, I'm not going to flood the earth anymore. So, the astrological and occult practices have been traced back to the history of Babel. Right? So, let's read verses 5 through 9. I'll make sure that So there's two things that show the rebellion of the people. Number one, they didn't spread out over the earth. That's question number 2. Number 3, it shows they didn't believe God when he said he wasn't going to flood the earth. Because this is their way of escaping, their way of not trusting God. Right? So let's read verses 5 through 9. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. So here is an example of God coming down to the earth to see what is happening. In Genesis, with Adam and Eve, we see that he would come down and get fellowship with them. Right? We read that story. As a matter of fact, they hide out after they've sinned, and they recognize the sound of God walking in the garden. So here we see that God comes down to see what's going on. How many knows you can't hide from God? Right? And so we see that. And the Lord said, indeed, the people are one, and they have one language, and this is what they begin to do now. Now, nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Now, let's stop there for just a minute. The power of unity here. One language. I mean, you get a lot accomplished when you're speaking the same language, when you have the same vision, whenever you're desiring to do the same thing. Even in the negative, it is true. You can come together as a people and decide that you're going to do something bad or evil, but if you're in unity, there's power in that, right? So we see that, and God says that now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Imagine if we all were on the same page, all speaking the same language. What do you mean, Pastor Bryan? We all speak English. Now, I'm talking about having the same vision, the same mindset. The mindset of Christ is what the Bible says. We're to put on his mind, right? So imagine what we could do for good if we're all on the same page, all running with the same vision, as the Bible tells us to write the vision and make it plain, that those that run, that see the vision and carry the vision, they might run and get it done, right? So there's power in unity and in speaking the same language or having the same vision. Now look. Come, let us go down. This is God speaking to himself. Let us. So, what word do you see there that alludes to the Trinity? Us. Us, right? So, God is speaking to himself. And you don't want to hear the 15-page paper I wrote on the Trinity, but I learned a whole lot about the Trinity lately, that research paper that I recently had to turn in. And there is the Bible throughout it, from beginning to end, really speaks of the Trinity. It's never spelled out as the word Trinity in the Bible, but it is totally backed up by Scripture throughout. So, interesting to see that. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad. Remember, they stayed there because they didn't want to get scattered. From there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the earth. I was reading in a commentary that I like to look at, and I think it's probably more than that, but time the commentary was written, there was over 100 languages across the world. So God really separated them. And God really gave them different languages. Can you imagine working together and they're making bricks and they're putting mortar on them and putting them together, and then all of a sudden you can't understand the boss. You can't understand the workers that are helping you. And so what would naturally happen? Exactly. You're going to gravitate to those that you could understand and could understand the language, and then you would probably move from there to a place where you could begin to work together, right? And so that's what God does to them. So the Lord came down. Let us go down, he says, that nothing they propose to do will be withheld from them. The Lord confused the language, and from there he scatters them over the face of the earth. Imagine what it would be like for your family. Everybody was family there, by the way, right? They all were of the lineage of Ham and Shem and Japheth, right? All of Noah. They're all working together. They're doing something that is not good. But now, certain parts of your family, you can't understand them anymore. And those, how many would say sometimes you don't understand your family anyway? But anyway, you know what I'm saying. Maybe not for reasons of speech, but other things. So it would be devastating on families. They'd be split apart because they couldn't understand each other, something that we don't always think about. And it was Nimrod who was the leader of this area. He was the one who held it all together, started this rebellion against God, because his name literally means "let us rebel." So very interesting. I learned some stuff during this, which I love. If you don't learn anything, at least I did. I mean, you know. Now, we're going to read the next section, which is kind of lengthy, but I want to read the whole thing. It's verse 10 through 25, so if you have your Bible, follow along with me. And what this is going to show us is that the lineage from Shem through to Abram, well, actually, it's the messianic lineage as well. So not only, so that answers two of your questions, by the way. Not only does this lineage of Shem lead us to Abraham, how many knows he's the father of the faith, that's what the Bible tells us, but it also is the messianic lineage. It is the one that can be traced from Adam all the way through to Christ. So it's very important. Many times we have a tendency to skip over lineages and look at them and never get a good commentary, never really look at it and say, oh, wait a minute, is that the Abram that the Bible talks about, that he's the father of the faith, and from him all the world will be blessed, and his lineage will be as the sand of the sea and the stars of the sky, all of that? Yes, that is what it is leading to. So we're going to read that. This is the genealogy of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begat Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. And he begat Arphaxad, after he begat Arphaxad, I should say, Shem lived 500 years and begat sons and daughters. Now, one thing you'll notice is there's also a gradual decrease in their age as we begin to look at the lineage. Arphaxad lived 35 years and begat Selah. And after he begat Selah, Arphaxad lived 403 years and begot sons and daughters. Selah lived 30 years and begot Eber. And after he begot Eber, Selah lived 403 years and begat sons and daughters. And Eber lived 34 years and begot Peleg. After he begot Peleg, Eber lived 430 years and he begot sons and daughters. Peleg lived 30 years. Also, if you'll notice, they start having children earlier in their life because they're not living as long either. So Peleg lived 209 years and begat sons and daughters. Reu, I think I skipped a verse there, but anyway. Reu lived 32 years and begat Serug. And after he begat Serug, Reu lived 207 years and begot sons, and daughters. Serug lived 30 years and begot Nahor. Now, it's not in your question, but anybody recognize the name Nahor? Anybody? No, it's a male. How about the grandfather of Abraham? Right? Nahor is the grandfather of Abraham. So Nahor lived 29 years and begat Terah. Who's Terah? If Nahor is the grandfather, who is Terah? The father of Abraham, right? And after he begat Terah, Nahor lived 119 years and begot sons and daughters. Right? So we see all this lineage, and if we really don't pay attention, and I can't tell you that I can pick those out all the time by myself, but you need to have a Bible that has at least a decent commentary in it, or maybe even an online study commentary that will help you really get to the depth of these, because it does help you to know. It's even helpful for us to understand our lineage. Do you know where you came from? Do you know who father, grandfather, and on back, and where did they come from? What nation did they come out of? What did they do for livings? You know, all those kinds of things. Those are helpful to understand why you are who you are. For instance, I can tell you that on my mom's side, you know, you can trace it pretty easy back to some German descendancy. And you can trace it back to Pennsylvania Dutch and all those kinds of things. So I understand that, which is a good history to know. My dad's lineage comes directly out of, oh my goodness, it just slipped my mind. Wales, England. And when you trace his lineage back, and I haven't done it, I know there's some preachers on my mom's side as well, because that'd be my great-grandfather, right? That was a preacher? Your grandfather, right? Barrick. So he was a preacher, but on my dad's side of the family, also there are many Baptist preachers. I'm not a Baptist preacher, but you know, I'm a preacher. So it's interesting when you begin to trace your lineage and see what you come from. And so it's important to even do that a little bit. So this is the genealogy of Shem that we just looked at. It is special because it leads us to Abraham, but it also is the messianic line that we'll see. And by the way, if you want to see that, you can turn to Luke chapter 3, and you'll see how that is portrayed there. Nahor, grandfather of Abraham. Terah, father of Abraham. And that Abraham was the one who the promise that from the seed of the woman that God would bring a deliverer. And do you remember that as far as Eve goes? So we've been tracing Genesis all the way up to this point, and we see that through Abraham, there'll be the seed of the woman that will be the deliverer. So let's read verses 26 through 28. Now Terah, which is Abraham's father, lived 70 years and begot Abram. How many knows that it wasn't Abraham first? It was Abram. We can talk about that. Nahor and Haran. This is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begot Lot, and Haran died before his father Terah in his native land in the Ur of the Chaldeans. Anybody ever heard of the Ur of the Chaldeans? Ur of Chaldees? What's important about that is that's where Abraham gets called from to go to a land that God has promised him, which is the promised land that eventually Israel will inherit, right? So it's we see the history beginning to start to develop. So I don't have to tell you, if you've read your Old Testament much, Abraham is an extremely important character in the Old Testament. He is mentioned 312 times in like 250-something different verses in the Old Testament. Well, no, not just in the Old Testament, throughout the Bible, 312 times. Because even in the New Testament, right? Hebrews is an example, chapter 11, Hall of Faith. You're going to see Abraham mentioned there, but also even in the Pauline epistles and different things, you're going to see that Abraham. So Abraham is very important, probably one of the most famous men in the Bible, very influential in history. Terah begat Abram. And Abram, just one thing unique about Abram is that he was called the friend of God. Not many in the Bible are called the friend of God. So here he is, a very important character in the Bible. That was James 2:23. Abraham, your friend forever, is mentioned in 2 Chronicles. And then Abraham, my friend, when God's speaking in Isaiah chapter 41. So Abraham was a friend of God. Could you think of a better friend than God? Because he's a friend that sticks closer than a brother, right? So let's look at Abraham, or Abram, and his brother Nahor. Then Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. How many knows what her name was later? Sarah, right? And the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. But Sarai was barren. She had no child. I may remember that story, right? We'll get to that, but it's worth showing here as we begin to see God's plan to bring forth a redeemer. And it'll come from this messianic line that we see. Anybody can tell me anything else about Sarah? Besides that she was barren? No. She was old when she had a baby, right?
She's related.
Huh?
She's related to Abram.
She is related to Abram. Anything else? Anybody ever look up what her name means? You'll love it. It means contentious. Do you remember any arguments that maybe Abram and Sarai at that time would have had? She was contentious. Yeah, right. So it's very interesting what names mean when we look at this. Anybody know what Abram means? Means father. Abram means father. When you get to Abraham, father of many, or father of many nations, is what that means. So very interesting. God is forthtelling through their names what will happen through them, right? Because Abram, or Abraham, I should say, is accredited for the whole lineage of Israel, right? He's the father of the faith. He is the one that all of that will, in the messianic lineage, all of that will come because of him. And so it's interesting to see that. All right. Let's read verses 31, 32. Now, what we didn't go do is look forward and find out what God told Abram to do. We mentioned it just a few minutes ago, but he said, leave where you are, leave the land, and leave the family. important. Because Abraham was not fully obedient. He was not. There's a couple things he did in error, and he paid for it. Big time. Because he was not fully obedient. He was partially obedient. Honestly, partially obedient is still disobedient. Right? When you only halfway do what God tells you to do. I'm not preaching to you all and not me, right? Sometimes we have a tendency to, we'll do this part that we want to, but not everything that God wants from us, right? So it's interesting. And Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot. So notice he's already being disobedient. The son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abraham's wife, and they went out with them from the Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan, and they came to Haran and dwelt there. Anybody notice a problem? Where were they told to go? They were told to go to Canaan. But Abraham came to Haran and dwelt there. There's a problem. Not fully obedient again. So the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So, very interesting. Abram's story begins in the Ur of the Chaldeans. That is Babylon. When you begin to look at it. Abram came from a family of idol worshippers. I mean, knew that. The Bible tells us that. Right? So that's why he's called to leave not just the land, but the people. Right? Because God is not a God that wants us to worship idols. What commandment tells us that? Number 1. Right? Right? Number 1. The very first one. Right? So he came out of a family of idol worshipers, and whenever Abram's grandson, this is interesting, Jacob goes back to Abram's relatives that were still worshiping idols. So that's why God said, get out, don't stay there, go where I told you to go, leave your people. That's hard. I am honestly very thankful that the Lord has not called me to be a missionary. That would be tough. To leave your nation, to leave your people and go to a place that God's called you to do. And to go, that would be very tough.
Unless it's in the Caribbean.
Huh? Unless it's in the Caribbean. I might be able to do it. I know there's a little Church of God church right there in Grand Cayman, right on the dock. I noticed that. And I looked at Teresa and said, do you feel the call? And she said, no. And I said, well, I didn't either, but I wanted to. Right? So they came to Haran and dwelt there. Let's see. So here's the two ways he was halfway obedient or disobedient. 2 ways. First, he brought his father and his nephew. Right? How many knows that his nephew caused a lot of problems? Some issues. Matter of fact, Abram has to separate not necessarily because of the relationship between him and his nephew, but because of those who were with Abraham and the workers that were with Lot couldn't get along. There was too many of them. And I'm telling you something you already know, but also what happens with Lot, he ends up where? In Sodom, right? And that's a whole issue. It requires Abram, I should say, to come and rescue him. And so, very interesting. First, so he did leave his own country, but he did not heed God's warning to not take his family with him. And then secondly, he dwelt in Haran, at least for a while. He stopped there. Very interesting as you look at that. If you do a word study on Haran, it's very interesting. It really kind of foretells the issues and the problems that Abram will have because he's not being fully obedient. It's very interesting. So they start out for Canaan. So far, so good. They're traveling. This is Spurgeon, by the way, who says this. They're traveling. They're weary. There's a huge caravan that has not gone very far before someone proposes that they remain at Haran. But that was not Canaan. Right? There is a danger in only going halfway to where God's called you to go. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, Lord, if you have, and I believe you have, called us to build out on the land, I don't want to get halfway and stop. That's just me. It has to be something that the Lord lays on your heart. But I certainly don't want to be guilty of stopping halfway, right? I want to carry out what God's called me to do, but also not just going out to the land, but what God's called me to do as a minister. I don't want to stop halfway, right? I've started this journey. How many say you've come too far to look back now, right? And so you want to keep going. So Terah dies in Haran. And like I said, sometimes you get meanings from names. The name Terah, which is, that's that's Abram's father, right? Terah dies in Haran. Guess what Terah means? It means delay. Wow. So he shouldn't have brought his father with him, but he did. Shouldn't have brought his nephew with him, but he did. And both of those caused issues. Abram was delayed in getting to the promised land because he stopped. Now, who wouldn't? But he stopped because his father's probably getting old and needs a place to die and be buried. But that was a delay that God didn't have for Abram. He was told to go. So the name Haran, which is the place that they stopped for a little while, means parched or barren. Wow. Could it be that maybe some of Sarai's barrenness was because of disobedience by Abram? Could it be? Because where they stopped means barren. Right? Nothing good came out of Haran. He was not fulfilling God's call in Haran. There was going to be no fruitfulness that would come from that place because he was in disobedience. Isn't that interesting? I've learned so much in this. When you just begin to look at the names, because I don't want to delay God's plan, and I certainly don't want to, in disobedience, be barren and not be fruitful as a child of God, right? If I was preaching, I'd say that partial obedience is still disobedience, right? Because that's what we see here when we look at it. So delay and barrenness marked Abram's life from that point. Could it be that it was delayed until he was 100 that he would have a child because of the partial obedience or disobedience? We don't know. I'm just postulating. Could it be? We don't know. But I can tell you one thing. I don't want to delay. I want to do what God's called me to do right here, right now. You believe that? Right? I think that's a really good lesson for us. One thing that the Charles Spurgeon says about Abram living in Haran He said the result of this to Abraham was the absence of privilege. Because remember, he's supposed to be in the promised land, but now he's got the absence of privilege. God didn't speak to him in Haran. He didn't have dreams or visions. No, the Bible doesn't record that God spoke to him at all whenever he was in Haran. Interesting. Do you want God to speak to you? I think we have to be obedient for God to really speak to us. We can live in disobedience. Was Abraham still chosen by God? Absolutely. But at that time, he's not living in full obedience to God, and he's experiencing a barrenness and a fruitlessness and delay and all those kinds of things. So I think that's very interesting when we begin to look at him. And we'll get further into that. So question 1, what does Nimrod mean? Let us rebel. Question 2, and you'll find the answer in chapter 9, verse 1. Why was it rebellious for the people to gather at Shinar?
God told them to spread out and fill the earth.
Yeah, because they were supposed to spread out and fill the earth. Very good. Question 3, why would building the tower be rebellious? Because it was built in unbelief that God wouldn't flood, right? They wanted to be in rebellion to that. They wanted to not believe God. And by the way, not believing God is rebellious.
Well, I thought it was interesting too. They said, let us build it for us.
Yes.
They weren't building it for God. They were building it for themselves.
Yeah, they weren't trying to help God out and do it.
No.
They were definitely, it was a protective mode for them. So anytime...
Which again is disbelief.
Huh?
Which again is disbelief.
Right. Anytime we try to do God's job for him, we're not living in obedience. What do you mean, Pastor? We can do certain things that really speak to God that we don't trust him. One example is to work from daylight to dark, nonstop, 7 days a week. Whenever we know that God says, you need to take at least one day, right, and rest. What does that tell? What is that saying? I don't trust God to take care of me, therefore I'm going to work. And there's nothing wrong with work. Work's a blessing. Remember, we talked about that. But working 7 days a week is going against God's plan, right? We can also try to take God's place when it comes to our children. And we can not allow them to grow up, not train them, and not let them, and not have them form a relationship with God, but only have a trust in us. That's not good. We need to train them up, as the Bible says, in the way they should go when they're young, so they don't depart, right? So there's just some ways that we can, I think, almost, we don't realize it, but we're saying to God that we don't trust God. Another way, thank you, Lord, that just came. Another way is that when we don't tithe or give offerings. Oh, Pastor, I knew you'd go there. Well, what does that say? It says that I've got to have 100%. When God said you'd do better if you only had 90 and you gave me the 10, right? So that's a matter of trust. Whenever, I've told you this before, whenever I jokingly say that when this part of us gets saved, we're really saved, right? Because that means we're trusting in God, right? Very interesting. All right. Question 4. What did God say about the people having one mind and one language? What did he say was a result of that?
Nothing can be withheld from them.
Anything they propose to do will not be withheld from them. It's not because God's not withholding it from them, because there literally is power and unity. Even in the secular world, when you come together, but there's also power from from a negative standpoint. Think about all the rulers throughout history who've been very evil and taken over nations and killed and rampaged and done all those things. And they had people who were in unity with them. That's why they could conquer like they did, right? So interesting when we see that. What word, question 5, alludes to the Trinity?
Us.
Us. Question 6, why was the city called Babel? I didn't spell this out, but it's in there. Because that's where the Lord confused their languages, right? We know that when we don't understand people and they're just, we don't understand, what do we say they're doing? They're babbling, right? So that word has come from the very beginnings of history to today. Question 7. Name 2 reasons why the lineage of Shem is important. Leads to Abraham, and what's the other one?
Messianic lineage.
Part of the Messianic lineage. Very good. How many times is the word Abram or Abraham used in the Bible? 312 times. That's a lot. Question 9. How was Abraham only halfway obedient? Number 1, he took his family with him. Number 2, he stopped in Haran. He dwelt there. It doesn't say that he just took a rest break. It says he dwelt there, right? So that's very important for us.